Good afternoon and welcome to today's Made by McGill alumni webcast, Migrants on the Move. My name is Derek Kassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Monday, April 3rd, 2023. The world is on the move like never before. According to the United Nations, nearly 90 million people are currently displaced from their homes as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations, including 27 million who have fled their countries as refugees. These are figures the world has never before seen. Many of these refugees are turning up at American and European borders, pleading to be let in. And since the start of this year, increasing numbers are making their way to Canada, some sponsored through government-sanctioned programs to support refugees fleeing war in Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, and hundreds more making the perilous journey from Central and South America and using irregular border crossings to gain a toehold into the country. And just a few days ago, we learned of the tragic deaths of 8 people, including young children, from 2 families who drowned when the boat they were riding in capsized in the St. Lawrence River near Akwesasne, straddling the Canada-US border. Why are issues such as migration and irregular border crossings suddenly making headlines? And how are governments and communities, here in Canada and elsewhere, preparing to cope with the influx of would-be immigrants? It's a complex and fast-moving topic, and joining me today to discuss it are 3 women who have dedicated their careers to studying the root causes of migration and developing ways to help migrants integrate into their new homes. Let me introduce them. Megan Bradley is an associate professor and William Dawson Scholar of Political Science and International Development Studies and coordinator of the McGill Refugee Research Group. Jennifer Elrick is an associate professor in McGill's Department of Sociology and the Canadian Studies Program Director at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. And Jenny Jeans is a 2-time McGill graduate who serves as Detention Program Coordinator at Action Refugee Montreal, a not-for-profit organization that seeks justice for asylum seekers and refugees. She is also Vice President of the Canadian Council for Refugees. Thank you all for joining me today for this important discussion. I know developments of the last few weeks have made it that your schedules have been really busy, so I really appreciate the time you're taking for us today. Before we get started, a note that if you're watching us live and you have any questions for our panelists, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca, and I'll do my best to address them to our guests. So let's get started. Professor Bradley, maybe I'll pick on you to start if you don't mind. As I mentioned in my introduction, the issue of legal and illegal migration is a developing story with breaking news almost every other day. But before we get into some of the more recent developments, I'd like to get a sense of how we got to this point. 90 million people displaced from their homes against their will seems like an awfully large number. Can you explain to us in broad strokes why we're seeing these record numbers of people on the move? And why has so much of humanity been forced to look for a new place to live?
Great. Well, thank you first for the invitation to be part of this conversation today. I'm glad to have the chance to speak with McGill alumni and also with friends and colleagues, including from Action Refugee Montreal, which I have to say is, I think, one of the best organizations in Quebec working on this issue, and I can't speak highly enough about their work. So in terms of why we're in this situation that we're in, as a social scientist, in some ways, this is a $1 million question. And it's obviously more complicated, as an academic will always say, than a soundbite. But, I think we can think of it in terms of 3 broad dynamics. First, we see a whole range of new conflicts that are generating increased rates of displacement. So within the last 15 years, we've of course seen the war in Syria, the situation in Ukraine, and then we also have other conflicts that we hear much, much less about, but which are displacing similar numbers of people, if not more. So for example, the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia is now one of the largest refugee situations and internal displacement situations worldwide. But I think many of us, just don't hear about that, especially if we're only taking in Western media. So first, we see this sort of increase in new conflicts and new people on the move in relation to that. Second, and here we're not necessarily talking just about international migration, so people who cross borders, but also people who are displaced within their own countries. In connection with climate change, we see increasingly severe and frequent disasters like hurricanes and wildfires, and those are displacing more and more people from their homes as well. And we see complex interactions between these kinds of environmental changes, armed conflict and other forms of violence, and then also socioeconomic dynamics that make it harder and harder for people to make a living where they are, which can, again, prompt onward movement. Many people who are displaced by disasters have a relatively short-lived displacement situation. So maybe they can go back to their homes and try to rebuild. But for refugees who've crossed international borders, especially in conflict contexts, this brings us to the third dynamic, which is the increasingly protracted nature of displacement situations. So historically, most refugees, if they fled their country, they were able to access citizenship in another country. You know, this had a lot to do with Cold War dynamics. So people who were fleeing conflicts associated with communism were often welcomed by Western countries in the millions. That kind of dynamic has really faded away now, such that even when we do resettle large numbers of refugees, as in the Syrian context, for example, this is still less than 1% of refugees worldwide. So the rest are left in this situation of protracted conflict and protracted displacement, with the average refugee situation now lasting about 20 years. So I would say those are sort of three broad dynamics that have brought us to the situation we're in today.
Wow. I guess you add all that up and you get to 90 million and counting, unfortunately. Well, thanks for that great introduction. I want to just turn to maybe to Ms. Jeans. I'm curious about something else. I know you, as someone who comes into direct contact with migrants on a daily basis, I mean, I know the things that Professor Bradley talked about, war and other sort of violence, has existed for forever, it seems. I'm wondering if you can speak to whether the recent rise in international migration numbers might also be fueled in part by things like the internet and social media, which perhaps have opened up more knowledge and possibilities for displaced people. So in other words, are migrants of this generation simply more aware than previous generations that there are pathways to escape and resettle elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, the role of technology in terms of forced migration and seeking refuge, seeking asylum. It's quite complex. There are different ways in which people seeking safety use technology. I wouldn't say that technology has increased displacement. And as Professor Bradley mentioned, a lot of what we know now about refugees in the world comes from the experiences of movement during the Second World War, where vast populations were displaced by conflict and persecution. Now, when people are on the move, most people in forced displacement do not have access to regular pathways. And we hear a lot of discourse from our current federal government, for example, that yes, Canada can welcome refugees, but those who come by regular pathways. But of course, a regular pathway, that often means somebody who's eligible for a visa to fly to Canada. Very few people fleeing persecution in the world would be able to get a visa to fly to Canada. So what are other options? They're by land. And as you mentioned, people coming up from South and Central America. If we look at Europe, North Africa and Europe, people traveling by boat to try and get to safety. And often it's using cell phones, smartphones. People are finding routes, finding ways through the forest, calling rescue boats if they're in distress on the Mediterranean, and getting information from other asylum seekers, and sometimes, unfortunately, from smuggling networks about how to travel. I wouldn't say that all information is easily dispersed, however. To come to Canada and be able to seek asylum, especially now that the border has been closed, people have to have a really strong, detailed understanding of our legal framework, including the exceptions. So right now the border is closed to most people seeking asylum, but there are some people who would fit into a few categories of exceptions. But to know that you wouldn't quite need a law degree to understand the differences, but people do not, when they're seeking safety, they do not necessarily know the specific legal frameworks of the countries that they're going to. And so I'd say there's a difference in terms of information about how to move versus what the context is of the place that they're moving to.
Right, that makes sense. So I do want to stick with the situation here in Canada specifically. And we've seen stories over the past few years, as you mentioned, Ms. Jeans, about African and Asian migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea to get to Europe, and of course, Central and South Americans, trying to flee over the Mexican border into the United States. But I don't ever recall so much discussion and activity and focus around Canada's land borders, which geographically speaking are so much further from traditional migrant routes. So Professor Elric, I know that you you focus a lot of your attention on sort of the Canadian situation. I'm wondering if you can tell us, who are these asylum seekers who've been turning up at Canada's borders? Where are they coming from, and how have they made their way so far north?
Well, I think you're right that we're not used to seeing people cross the border. This visibility dimension is something that I think is really going to change the discussion in Canada. Although I do want to highlight that, what we see, for example, people crossing Roxham Road, all these images circulating in the media, is not the entirety of asylum movements into Canada. We have a pretty strong Asylum in Canada program, in addition to our resettlement of refugees from abroad. And so whereas we're not used to seeing people, it's not that people have not been entering Canada to claim asylum over the past, so looking back over the past 10 years or so. If we look around roughly between 2010 and 2022, we're averaging about 35,000 asylum claims a year, which hides some difference. But to get to your specific question, people we are seeing now turn up at crossings like Roxham Road, in my understanding, are most often from Haiti, Turkey, Colombia, Chile, Pakistan, and Venezuela as the top countries of origin. And most people who seek asylum via land or often via sea, most people who seek asylum do so through a multi-stage journey. So we have very varied pathways before the final border crossing into Canada. So, certainly for Haitians, Colombians, Chileans, and Venezuelans, we're talking mainly about a land journey across multiple borders. And for the other nationalities, there are varied pathways into different countries. So people can very well enter on tourist or visiting visas in Southern America and or the United States, and then decide to make their way to Canada.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I'm wondering how much of this recent shift north in migration patterns that we've seen can be traced to perceptions that Canada has become a more welcoming place for newcomers compared to the United States, which is always seen as sort of the beacon, the Statue of Liberty, the welcoming place. And now we're in this, how do I call it, post-Trump era, and moods have changed. So how much is that is sort of known amongst migrants and immigrants? And how much is that driving migration north into Canada? Mm-hmm. Professor Bradley, you want to jump on that one?
Sure, I can at least try to make a beginning in answering that question, which is an important one and a difficult one. I think it's important when we think about this kind of question to recognize that the scope of what's happening on the Canadian border barely registers in the global politics around refugee crises. I mean, it's easy, I think, if you read the Canadian media, to lose track of that, but more than 80% of the world's refugees remain in developing countries, so in what we often call the global south. The world's top 4 host countries, for example, are all developing countries that it takes a lot more resources, it puts a lot more strain on their economies to do this kind of hosting work. So Colombia, Uganda, Turkey, Pakistan, these are countries that host millions of refugees. And so what's happening at Roxham Road, I think really needs to be kept in context there. Part of this context is also that the majority of refugees or would-be refugees never actually make it out of their own countries in the first place. So the majority are displaced within their own countries. So I think we need to sometimes temper this idea that people are all looking to make it to a wealthy country, because that's just simply not true in terms of aims and aspirations that people have for their lives, but also in terms of the resources to make those journeys. A lot of people just can't possibly achieve that. But more specifically, in terms of Canada-US relations and whether this perception of welcoming is moving the needle on arrivals, I mean, we have in some ways similar, but important ways different systems for refugee status determination in Canada versus in the United States. So this is a legal process through which an individual's claim to be a refugee would be recognized. So if we think about people who entered through Roxham Road, for example, over the last year, I think the estimates are about 30%, if not a little bit more, of those individuals 30% of the claims that have been adjudicated within the last year have actually been recognized. So that's actually an important proportion of people who have entered by foot being recognized as refugees who have a legal entitlement to protection here. And those are people whose claims probably would not have been recognized in the United States. So we need to think carefully about the ways in which these systems work differently. Perhaps for some people that creates a kind of interest in coming here. But we also need to recognize that we have a legal system that says that in terms of how we understand our own legal responsibilities, those are people who we do have an obligation to protect, to make sure that they're not returned to a situation where they would face risks to their lives. So that's a really important aspect of this conversation, I think.
Great. I see Ms. Jeans, you want to jump in? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. I think another thing about a nuance on Canada's welcome is that we really have a very strict visa regime. It's very difficult to get a visa to come to Canada. And we're frequently hearing in the news about human rights activists, medical researchers, athletes, musicians who are used to going to conferences, competitions, events around the world, but can't come to Canada because they're denied a visa to visit because of this fear that certain people, in particular from Africa and other regions of the world, may not leave at the end of their stay. And so there's a real invisible wall that's put up against people who are probably not coming to seek asylum, but have this stigma just because of where they're from. And of course, if some of them did make a refugee claim once they arrived, they might have very good reason to. It's a bit ironic. One of the reasons why many people have crossed in recent years from the US to Canada to make a refugee claim is because for many countries, it's a lot easier to get a visitor visa to go to the US than it is to come to Canada. And so some people who feel that they will be safer in Canada will first enter the US and then travel northward. In terms of other movements from further south, I work with a lot of people from a Democratic Republic of Congo who are fleeing persecution and violence, including a lot of gender-based violence there. And the only way they can get away is to travel to Brazil and then move upwards. And it's often a matter of where can you travel to? And Canada is very, again, I can't say it enough, very hard to travel to. We are really, as Professor Bradley said, cut off from most of the migration flows in the world.
Wow.
May I also add something small?
Yeah, please.
Just while we're in the process of contextualizing this discussion, I just wanted to, in terms of numbers specifically, add to Professor Bradley's contextualization, which was putting Canada's refuge and asylum numbers in global perspective. I think one thing to keep in mind with these numbers too is also their size relative to our other immigration commitments in Canada. I mean, we can't forget that Canada has made an explicit commitment to mass immigration. And if we add up the number of people we are willing to admit as permanent residents, either economic immigrants, family, or refugees, as well as the number of people we take in a given year on temporary permits, for example, temporary foreign workers, we're operating somewhere in the million, in the region of 1 million admissions a year. Give or take, if we add up all of these categories. And so when we look at Roxham Road and we think, okay, in 2022, there were around 39,000 admissions by the end of the year, you have to put that in relation, so see that in proportion to who we're willing to otherwise admit, and think about the proportion of spots that we reserve for people in need.
Right. But just to pick up on that question, I mean, that gets into a very touchy political dynamic, correct? And because, I mean, the government is saying we want to admit a certain number of immigrants, and they have a particular idea of who these people are and where they're coming from, right? Whereas who shows up at the border are not necessarily the same people from the same country. So I guess it does get a bit sensitive, right?
It can get a bit, I think you've touched on an important point, especially around the visibility of land border crossings. And that is, Canada has been rather unique for the past 70 years since World War II in its broad public acceptance for immigration. And also, even as recently as fall 2022, according to an Environics survey, even support for resettling refugees. There's actually immense public support while we run this mass immigration system. That's rather unique. But I think one of the reasons that we enjoy this support is the strong belief among the Canadian public that we are in control and that we select people. People do not select us. And this is a position we've been able to be in part due to our geographic insulation, which you alluded to earlier. We don't share a major land border with a country from the global south. We don't have a conflict zone immediately next door, and it is, as Ms. Jeans already said, immensely difficult to reach Canada directly through our impenetrable visa regime. And so we are used to being in a position of choosing, and we are very selective. And so, yes, we are, when it comes to saying, well, what are our obligations to people whom we might not otherwise select? I think we're important political territory, but also, as Professor Bradley said, political in the sense of international obligations, right? I mean, we are signatories to the 1951 Geneva Convention, 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, we have made formal commitments. And so it's political both in the sense of internally, domestically, but internationally as well.
And it's an interesting point because when you mentioned earlier, I think Professor Bradley, the countries that have the most refugees on their soil right now, Colombia, Uganda, Turkey, Pakistan, I realize all sort of happen to sit next to some of the most troubled countries in the world. So most refugees are sort of skipping over one border to get to safety and not necessarily coming as far as Canada. I have so many more questions around the political situation as well. We'll see if we get to that. Just a reminder, if you're watching live and you would like to submit a question, you can send it to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. Ms. Jeans, I'm just curious if I could just turn to you again. I know you're working obviously with a not-for-profit group here in Montreal. Can you tell us a little bit about what the situation is like on the ground for migrants, refugees, asylum seekers who do make it to Montreal? What are the conditions like for them? And what are some of the most serious concerns facing both them and the governments who are trying to sort of handle their arrival?
Well, until the recent closure of Roxham Road and expansion of the Safe Third Country Agreement, there were a lot of people who were first entering into Quebec to make a refugee claim, although not even the majority of claims in Canada last year were made by people crossing at Roxham Road. So there are also people who come by plane who travel to other regions of Canada and make a refugee claim where they first arrive. When people first arrive, there's quite a heavy sort of bureaucratic administrative process. People have to identify themselves, provide quite a significant amount of biographical information in terms of it's true that people making a refugee claim aren't selected in advance, but they're heavily screened and monitored. And actually, I work with those who end up in detention, for example. When they arrive, they're lacking documents to confirm their identity. They can be detained. And so people have to go through quite a series of administrative hoops to get registered as refugee claimants, to have their claim referred to the Immigration and Refugee Board for an eventual decision on the merits of their refugee claim, and to get paperwork. Once they have that initial paperwork, they do have access to a last resort financial assistance, depending on the province that they're in. They may have access to legal aid to help find a lawyer to support them with their claim. Again, it depends on which province they're in. Some provinces don't have legal aid for refugee claimants. And the role of a legal representative in the process is really crucial to be able to put one's story forward and be recognized as a refugee. So people have access to certain basic supports, again, with some variation on where they first land. There's been a lot of concern in Quebec that there was maybe too much of a share on the part of the Quebec government to be covering the basic needs, because so many refugee claimants were entering through Roxham Road, which is, of course, in Quebec. But many people do move on and go to Ontario, go to Manitoba, end up in British Columbia, go elsewhere. One of the big barriers that people have had is getting access to a work permit. So not having to rely on last resort financial assistance, but to be able to work. it's really a priority for most people, and they don't want to be reliant on social assistance. And we had a lot of administrative delays, but the federal government has actually been working hard recently to put in place some innovations to reduce the delays, to speed up access to the work permit. And what is, again, a sad irony is just as measures have been put in place to really speed up that access to a work permit so that people can move on, can support themselves, can settle in communities across Canada. At the same time, the border has been closed. And so many of those people are now just blocked any access to protection and asylum in Canada. So that just touches on some of the areas there are challenges. But there's also been a lot of resilience in terms of community organizations trying to meet the needs.
So maybe that's a good moment to sort of pause on that safe third country agreement that was just signed, I think, a little over a week ago by government officials in Canada and the United States around, I think, just preceding Joe Biden's visit to Ottawa. Can one of you maybe explain a little bit about what exactly the safe third country agreement represents? What is the agreement meant to do, and how might it affect the fate of refugees who do make it to Canada's borders?
I'm going to defer to either of the two refugee experts.
I could jump in, and Megan, Professor Bradley can complete me.
All right.
Megan is good.
So the Safe Third Country Agreement, it was enforced since the end of 2004, actually, so it's not new in and of itself. It's an agreement between Canada and the US that basically says that if a person arrives in one of the two countries, they cannot then go to the shared land border and make a refugee claim to the other country. They have to stay in the first country in which they landed to make their refugee claim. There were some exceptions. There still are some exceptions. So, for example, if somebody has a close family member in Canada, they might be exempt from this agreement. Of course, it's always important to get good legal advice because, as I mentioned earlier, those exemptions can get quite technical in terms of their application. But this agreement did not apply to people who cross the border irregularly. It only applied at the official ports of entry at the land border. And so the reason why Roxham Road, which was an irregular entry point into Canada, why that was a way for people to walk across the border and ask for protection, it's because once their foot was inside Canada, this agreement no longer applied. And some people saw that as disorganized, but actually, if you look very closely at the process that was put in place, where first the RCMP screens people who've arrived, then transfers them to the Canada Border Services Agency for further examination, it was all quite organized, but it was a way around the Safe Third Country Agreement. So what happened just over a week ago is that an agreement, which was actually signed over a year ago, was announced between the two countries to expand the Safe Third Country Agreement so that it now applies to the entire land border and shared waterways. And so anybody who crosses over into Canada irregularly can be sent back to the United States. Prior to this expansion, the US simply wouldn't have accepted them. And so the person would have stayed in Canada, but now they can be sent back. Exceptions still do apply. So some people are exempt, but most people will be turned back to the United States. Unfortunately, where many don't actually have access to asylum, I won't get into all the rules in the United States, but there are asylum bars, there are restrictions. There are people who don't get recognized where Canada would recognize them. So for many people, it's unfortunately not a safe country, but they're affected by this agreement. I don't know if Professor Bradley wanted to add anything further.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I just would emphasize, we often hear these terms legal and illegal come up in conversations like this. The overarching principle that I think we always need to bear in mind in a conversation like this one is that seeking asylum is not a crime. It's a right under international human rights law. And what agreements like the Safe Third Country Agreement are for, they're for governments to try to preserve this notion of control that we've been talking about, to sort of be selective and manage a situation that can feel unruly. So I think we have to think about the Safe Third Country Agreement in that context. So, this is something, it's an agreement governing the exercise of a legal right, and in a sense, trying to restrain the ways in which that can be exercised. From the perspective of the Canadian government, interested in achieving that kind of control, reducing the numbers of people who make it here, this agreement is a real win for Ottawa. And I think sometimes in the public conversation that can be lost. Ottawa works hard to get the United States to agree to this, to make the kinds of concessions, the amendments that were achieved in relation to Biden's visit. Those were negotiated over months and months and months. They weren't publicly announced. But this is an agreement that, from the perspective of a federal government that's interested in controlling numbers, very much works in Canada's favor. And again, this is as we understand our interests in terms of lower numbers.
Mm-hmm. But it seems...
So I should also say, people may be aware that it's being challenged in federal court right now around this question of whether the United States really is a safe third country. So we can think about practices such as rendition in the context of the early years of the war on terror, the Trump administration's policies towards refugee and migrant families. Those are questions that really, I think, give us pause in terms of whether the US really is a safe third country for migrants and refugees.
Right, which was leading to my next question, which was that if you look at the overall sort of migration patterns, coming up from Latin America, it just seems so chaotic that you've got all these, would-be asylum seekers on the Mexican-US border. Some are getting across. Now you've got southern states, I guess, governors trying to prove a political point. So they're sending them up on planes and buses to like Martha's Vineyard and New York City and saying, you take them. And then the mayor of New York is putting them on buses to Plattsburgh. I mean, it's almost like an invitation to keep going, move along. So I guess my question is, does this whole process have to be so chaotic and so bizarre? And are we not able to learn lessons from, I think, what we've seen in Europe, where you've got all these Syrian and Afghan and African refugees making their way to, Turkey and Greece, and then sort of being forced up through these hostile countries in the Balkans and Hungary. And so I guess my question is, why does it need to be so chaotic? Is there not a way to just figure this out and make it more seamless? Tough question, I know. Professor Erler, you want to take that one?
I think the simple answer is yes, it is possible to make this easier, and no, it does not have to be so chaotic and bizarre. These are political choices that countries like Canada, the EU, etc., have made to make access to their territories, which is what in international law activates rights claims, right, is actually accessing territories. I mean, these countries, and Canada, EU, Australia, you name it, have gone to great lengths in the past decades to play with this idea of space and to make it very, very difficult for people to actually reach their territory and thereby activate their claims to basic human rights, including asylum. These are choices that have been made, political choices that enjoy broad support in a lot of jurisdictions. And like all choices, they have consequences, and the consequences are is usually the immense loss of human life, human suffering. This is one thing we learn again and again as migration researchers, is the more closed borders are, really the higher the death toll, because the pressures to move, the impetus to cross an international border, be it from a mix of political and or economic and or just basic concerns for safety, all of these reasons often come together. We know that people move for on a spectrum of motivations. If you may come from a conflict region, but what happens in conflict regions, people tend to lose their livelihoods, so it becomes also an economic survival, social mobility question. These are all things bundled together, and the global pressures creating the need to move for a combination of reasons are not disappearing. And so, as long as our response is to make ordered legal pathways to accessing our territories more difficult for the majority of human beings, the more disorderly movements we're going to see, the greater reliance on human smugglers, higher death tolls, etc. We could make other choices.
Right, which I guess leads to sort of a more philosophical question that I've been thinking a lot about as I've been preparing for this conversation, which is sort of, what do we as a society, as humanity want to do, or what are we able to do, willing to do to help other humans in need? I was just reading that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees declared that governments around the world had pledged some $1.13 billion, a record amount, provide a lifeline to people displaced by war, violence, and human rights violations. But I think most of this money is really earmarked to sort of support refugee camps far away from Western countries. So, I mean, is that the right solution? Or is there some broader or higher calling that countries like Canada, Australia, the United States, the UK ought to be thinking about in terms of opening their borders and their space up to welcome more of humanity?
Well, sure. I think in terms of camps and sort of humanitarian maintenance, as it's sometimes called, we know that encampment of refugees, it's not the majority of refugees worldwide who are encamped, and we have this sort of iconic image of the camp, but it is a minority of refugees who live in camps. But they are costly, and we know that in terms of people's quality of life and well-being, in terms of the economic aspects, camps are the worst possible decision. They tend to be established very quickly, and then they become entrenched, such that they, continue on over decades, if not longer. So, yes, opportunities for people to live in host communities, whether that's in the global south or making their way on, ideally through safe and regular pathways to Western countries who frankly need their contributions. I think that we know that this is the way forward. But, as you say, we end up with these sort of bizarre situations where people are making extremely dangerous trips. And that's just a consequence, again, just to reiterate the points that my fellow panelists have made, of the political decisions that are being made here. But, channeling more money into humanitarian response, this is essential in the context of the situation, the system that we've created. We can't get away from that unless we're willing to create better and safer opportunities for very large numbers of people. So, the kinds of resettlement programs that Canada is involved in running are absolutely wonderful, and they're vital. But less than 1% of refugees worldwide, again, to reiterate that stat, every year, 1% of refugees access those opportunities. And it's usually, in the Canadian context, people who already have family here. So it's wonderful that people can be reunited, but how do we expand that opportunity so more people can access it? I think that that's a key question here.
If I could jump in, there's really no one answer to your question, Derek. I mean, it's also important to look at root causes, and sometimes Canada has commercial interests in certain countries like Eastern Congo, for example, and Eritrea, where Canada has mining interests that have been documented to be involved in sometimes supporting governments that then people are fleeing from. So there's a real global perspective. That is not my expertise, but when you work in these areas, the world kind of shrinks, and you see global conflicts at work in the people that you meet. But there is resettlement, a way for Canada to help to protect more people in the world is through government resettlement of refugees and private sponsorship of refugees. But those are not legal international obligations that Canada has. Those are real humanitarian moves, and Canada could do more there. But the right to seek asylum, that is really entrenched in international law. And if we look at, how to have this in a more organized way, we have actually a specialized expert independent tribunal in Canada that's been recognized around the world. It's not perfect, but it's a very good adjudicator of refugee claims. And so having people come here who have a fair and efficient process to get a decision as to whether their refugee claim has merits or not, that is an organized response. But blocking people at the border creates more chaos, especially when we don't know what will happen to them. I mean, right now, people have been turned away. There are Haitians who've been turned away. There are Afghans who've been turned away, people who are fleeing the Taliban, coming to the Canadian border, and the response they're getting is, you might get protection in the United States. But there's actually quite a lot of documentary evidence to show why certain people will not be protected in the US. But if they came into Canada, Canada could relatively effectively and efficiently adjudicate their refugee claim. And so I think that having maintained access to asylum system not only maintains our international obligations, but it also reduces, as you say, this notion of sort of disorganization or chaos. It's more organized.
May I speak to the broader ethical question that
yes,
you
please.
had, because I think that's a fascinating one too. In addition to the more on the ground discussion here about camps and money and pathways. I mean, there are some great political philosophers doing work in this field. For anyone out there who's interested, at the University of Toronto, Professor Joseph Cairns and Professor Ayelet Shachar, who really tackle this big question of what is our obligation as citizens in a global North country towards people elsewhere. And I think it would be very hard to summarize that literature in a soundbite, but I think broadly speaking, these philosophers come down on the side of, by our own standards, by our own philosophical standards, commitment to liberalism, etc., we can and should be doing more than we do. I think it really helps sometimes to take a step back, because we're so used to, in the global North, we're used to thinking of, well, we have this country and we have control over the borders. We as the Canadian government has a right to decide who comes in, etc. But we're not quite used to sitting back and thinking about our own privilege on the global scale. Ayelet Shachar, for example, whom I just mentioned, talks about citizenship as a birthright lottery. And your passport being the biggest piece of inherited property that you'll ever have, the biggest thing transmitted from your parents, because our life choices, regardless of inequalities within Canada, within the United States, are largely determined by an accident of birth. And so it's a big question that can't be answered. But what is the obligation of those who have won the birthright lottery towards those who have drawn the shorter straw through no fault of their own, given that we live in an interconnected world, and given the fact that our economic success, the success of the G7, also our relative protection from climate change is built on the backs of the exploitation of other countries, right? We are not it is not that each country like Canada or United States exists in a global bubble. We have these long processes of international globalization, the economic round, colonialization, imperialism, all of these exploitative economic forces that have generated our immense wealth and our immense political power, that has really solidified this birthright lottery. And to say that we get to enjoy that without any formal obligation towards those who have historically been exploited, who are, as a result, indirectly of our actions, or often directly, living, at the forefront of the dangers of climate change, etc. I think it's a big question to answer, but it's one that I think we in the global North increasingly need to ask ourselves.
Yeah, well, very well said. So just a reminder, if you're watching live, we have a few minutes left and you have questions for us. You can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. I do have a couple that have come in, but let me just bring it back to the immigration question again. And I have this question that I'm sort of thinking about sort of the political tenor that we sort of experience here in Canada and certainly south of the border and elsewhere in Europe, and how this is framing the question around immigration. So this is a question I could have opened the entire conversation with, but I kind of chose to leave it to the end because I think having a bit of context is helpful. But the question is immigration a good thing or a bad thing for countries like Canada and the United States? Professor Bradley, you want to jump on that one?
Well, I mean,
I keep picking on you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's an essential thing. And I think it is. Oh, it's not just a sort of good thing. It's an incredibly valuable thing. It's a gift in many ways that people come and make their lives here. And they're contributing to this society in becoming part of it. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think I necessarily need that long to answer the question. I think it is absolutely a net positive. It is, it's a policy challenge in a range of different ways, but, we would be in such a more difficult situation right now as a country if we didn't have the kind of large scale immigration that we do. I think that's
okay. So
there's no debate about that.
May I support that with just a few numbers, just to make it clear to people? I agree completely. But currently, immigration accounts for 75% of Canada's population growth. Remember, we have an aging population and declining fertility, and it also accounts for 100% of our labor force growth currently, especially in essential sectors. If you look at the percentage of immigrants, people who were born outside of Canada, moved to Canada in critical sectors like healthcare. Depending on whether you're looking at nursing or physicians or dentists, it ranges between 25 and 40% of our active workforce in the healthcare sector. So yes, overall, demographically, economically, it's essential.
So before you jump in, Ms. Jeans, I'm going to make it a bit tougher, this question. And I guess my question is, given all of that and given the aging population and the labor shortages that we're experiencing, why is it that so many politicians, so many people in the public sort of react in such a visceral and negative way to immigration when it comes up as a topic? Why has this become sort of a talking point for many opposition politicians or politicians on the right? I mean, how do we handle all of that?
I mean, these are big topics for just a few minutes. My experience is really on the ground, but I think there's a connection there, because when you work day by day with refugee claimants, with people seeking protection, you immediately are connected to the humanity of it all. Whereas when you are disconnected at the political level, you can talk about refugees, about asylum seekers, border crossers, in a very disconnected, dehumanized way, where it just becomes a political kind of a scapegoating or a political debate. And you forget that these are real human beings who very often are fleeing persecution. And as soon as anyone starts to hear stories that people are telling when they come, it changes the way that I think that refugee claimants are seen. And we've had great outpourings of generosity and welcome in Canada to refugees from the same people who might on another day be concerned about irregular border crossings. So I think that keeping a human face, also remembering our legal obligations, that often gets forgotten in the political debate. What is the right to seek asylum? And I mean, governments are very clear that they need immigration, but I think it was Professor Elric who said that they want to be able to select who comes. But there's a flip side to that. Like right now, a lot of people are coming as temporary foreign workers with closed work permits, and they are vulnerable to sometimes horrific exploitation and abuse in Canada. And these are people who have come through an organized, regular pathway that is created and condoned by governments, that leaves people really at the mercy sometimes of what can be very abusive employment conditions. And so I think that we need to put the rhetoric aside and look at what's really happening on the ground. So I guess that's the role that community organizations can play, is to bring real stories forward into what can otherwise be very disconnected political debates.
Right. Okay.
May I add to that shortly? Because I think that's an important impulse. I think that's a call to action that we should all keep in mind in the coming years, because I think there is great temptation to play the anti-immigrant card, the anti-refugee card politically, because it's quite an expedient move. I think we're seeing in multiple contexts right now. It does things very, some very effective things all at once for politicians who do it. It can immediately be a sort of community building exercise of social closure by saying, these others are our threat to us. That creates a sense of a we, it's a threat to who we are. But also, especially in current politics, it can be very convenient to scapegoat immigrants and refugees for political and social issues that are actually very, do not in the first instance have to do with immigration or refugee policy. And I'm thinking here concretely of all of these discourses we're seeing recently about, how our housing system, we have this housing shortage, our healthcare systems are at a breaking point, our education systems are overloaded. And by pointing a finger and saying, we need to use this as, an excuse to stop for more people from coming in. I mean, that's a much easier thing to do and say than to say, well, look, the provinces have been systematically defunding, disinvesting from their housing, their health, and their other policies since 1990s. This is a bigger problem to tackle. It requires greater investment. It requires an acceptance of responsibility on the part of politicians of various parties. And I think it can be much easier and much more expedient to say, this is, for this reason, we have to just focus on the immigrant threat or the refugee threat. And so I think Ms. Jean's comment is very important, that moving forward, as it becomes more tempting to play this anti-immigrant, anti-refugee card, I think we're going to have to rely on people's willingness to see behind the rhetoric and to think in humane terms.
If I could just talk about a bit of that humanity, during the pandemic in Quebec anyway, a very large proportion of people working in healthcare as personal care attendants, but doing a lot of other essential work, were themselves refugee claimants, and really kept our healthcare system going, took care of our elderly. And some of them died of COVID, and they were really at the forefront. And a special program was created to try and provide permanent residence to some of those people. But once you dig a little deeper, you realize that we can't separate immigrants and refugees. We can't separate, refugees who came irregularly versus regularly. They're all the same people. And we had some tragic stories during the pandemic.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you all for those comments. We did get a question from one of our viewers, so maybe I'll put it to you, Professor Bradley. You're the sort of international expert here. This one has a bit of that dynamic. So it came to us from Victor Ng. So he writes, apart from refugees on the move, there are a large number of migrants from Hong Kong moving to the UK, Canada, and Australia, estimated at over 200,000 over the past 2 years. These are mainly well-educated young people with families. His question is, how do you see these movements and the impact they might have on the UK and Canada in terms of social demands on education, housing, healthcare, and job markets? So I guess similar to what Professor Elric was just touching on, but specifically sort of young, educated migrants with families.
Yeah, well, these are often folks who are amongst the target populations for government recruitment, right? So people who are well recognized as being in a great position to contribute to the Canadian economy. So I can't speak to the sort of the specifics of that population, but as much as Jenny was saying that, it's difficult to separate out refugees and migrants. I completely agree. I think in many ways that's true when we're talking about people who have really experienced a range of forms of hardship and real pressure to move, whether that's economic pressure, political pressure, violence. For a lot of folks, that becomes very murky, but we can think about it on a spectrum where there are sometimes people who make the choice to move, whether that's for education or labor, and people who had almost no choice whatsoever in that decision. When we're thinking about people coming from Hong Kong, there are often also political considerations at play there. So sometimes this is also a population that reminds us of the ways in which these groups are intertwined legally and then also empirically.
May I add briefly to that?
Yes, yes, yes.
With apologies for the car alarm going off in the background, which I'm afraid I can't do anything about. I think part of the answer to this question is also it will be what is what is Canada going to do policy wise in the areas of education, housing, and health. That's going to have a big effect on any cohort of new arrivals moving forward. And I think even bracketing immigration, we have a lot of work to do in those areas. But also, I think it's really the ball is in Canada's court, and this would go equally for the UK, the other countries mentioned in the question. It's also a question of, well, what do we really do with the people once they arrive? As Professor Bradley said, these are often people with immense potential, especially if they are already selected to enter based on their skills and their education. But we have a disastrous issue in Canada with skill utilization among highly skilled immigrants. We're very bad at translating their credentials into ensuring their employability. Some recent statistics say that over 25% of immigrants with higher education degrees are in jobs that are in jobs that really only require a high school diploma. And we only have about 40% of foreign trained physicians working as physicians. So, the one side of the question is, well, who comes? But also the other side is, what institutional supports are available in Canada to make sure that it's the best situation for everyone.
Right, right.
I'd also just like to say that a lot of teachers, a lot of nurses, a lot of construction workers are immigrants and refugees. So it's not a matter of coming and consuming services provided. It's also offering those very services, recognizing that, yes, there are barriers to credential recognition, as Professor Elric points out.
Right. Thank you. So we only have a couple of minutes left. We just got one more question. I'll try to get it in. Maybe Ms. Jeans, you might be best placed. It's about the Safe Third Country Agreement, I think. So a question from Hannah London. She wants to know, why did the United States push for the extension of this policy? Do they want more would-be Canadian refugees sent back to the United States?
It was Canada who pushed for it, and a lot of people didn't think that it would ever happen because there didn't seem to be an interest for the United States. It seems to be that the United States, in many ways, has done this as a favor to Canada in the spirit of a good relationship. There's also another aspect to the agreement where Canada has agreed to accept 15,000 people selected by the US at their southern border with Mexico to be relocated to Canada. We're waiting still for details as to how exactly that would work. So they did get some kind of benefit in the sense of being able to move some of the people from their southern border. It's a very small percentage of the people who are coming to the US seeking protection. But it was really sort of acquiescing to pressure from Canada.
Okay, great. So it looks like we're just at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, this has been such a fascinating conversation and so much to unpack. And I apologize if I threw too many philosophical or broad questions at all of you, but I think you all answered extremely adeptly. So like I said, this does wrap up the time we have today. Before we bring the webcast to a close, I'd like to remind you that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. And of course, I'd like to extend my deep gratitude to our three guests, Professors Megan Bradley and Jennifer Elric from here at McGill, and Jenny Jeans from Action Refugee Montreal, for joining today and providing such credible insight and understanding into this really complex topic of migration, refugees, immigration. I know I certainly learned a lot during today's conversation. I imagine most of our viewers did as well. Please continue to stay tuned to your McGill email and social media feeds over the coming weeks as we continue to share news about exciting online and in-person programming. Until then, happy Passover, happy Easter, happy Ramadan. Please be well, stay safe. Thank you.